They say money changes people, but I never thought it would turn my own family into strangers. What started as a simple request to help with the family finances became the most devastating betrayal of my life. By the time I realized what was happening, they had already taken everything that mattered to me. But they made one crucial mistake. They underestimated exactly how far I would go to uncover the truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Blank. _ blank. My name is Rachel Martinez, and for the past 18 years, I've built my reputation as one of Portland's most trusted financial consultants. I've helped dozens of small businesses navigate their most challenging fiscal storms, turned failing ventures into profitable enterprises, and guided families through complex estate planning that preserved their legacies for generations to come. My clients don't just hire me for my expertise with numbers. They trust me because I understand that behind every balance sheet, there's a human story worth protecting. The irony of what happened next isn't lost on me. The woman who spent nearly 2 decades safeguarding other people's financial futures couldn't see the trap being laid in her own family. I met David Chen during my 3rd year of graduate school at Portland State University. He was studying business management while working nights at his family's restaurant, a small but bustling establishment in southeast Portland that served authentic Taiwanese cuisine to a loyal community of regulars. David had this quiet determination about him, the kind that comes from watching your parents build something from nothing and knowing that one day, the responsibility would fall to you. The Chen family story was quintessentially American in its ambition and sacrifice. Robert and Patricia Chen had arrived in Portland in 1985, with barely enough English to order groceries and a dream bigger than their modest savings account. They scraped together enough money to lease a tiny space in what was then a struggling strip mall, spending 18-hour days learning the restaurant business through pure trial and error. Patricia worked the kitchen with a precision that bordered on artistry, while Robert charmed customers with his genuine warmth and gradually improving English. By the time I married David in 2008, Chen's Garden had expanded to 3 locations across the Portland metro area. The original restaurant had become a neighborhood institution, the kind of place where 3 generations of families celebrated birthdays and where the staff knew your order before you sat down. Robert and Patricia had achieved something remarkable. They had built not just a business, but a legacy. What drew me to David wasn't just his dedication to his family's success, but his genuine respect for the work it had taken to build it. He understood sacrifice in a way that resonated with my own upbringing. My parents had immigrated from El Salvador when I was 6, and I had watched them work multiple jobs to put me through college. David and I shared that particular understanding of family obligation, the weight of carrying forward something precious that had been built through pure determination. The early years of our marriage were a delicate balance of building our own life while honoring our responsibilities to the family business. David gradually took over more of the day-to-day operations, while I maintained my independent consulting practice. We had found a rhythm that worked. I would review the restaurant's books quarterly, offering advice on tax strategies and investment opportunities, while David focused on expansion and operations. Michael, David's younger brother, had always been the creative one in the family. While David inherited his father's head for business, Michael possessed his mother's artistic sensibilities. He had studied culinary arts in California before returning to Portland with grand ideas about modernizing the family restaurants. His wife, Jennifer, brought her own set of skills to the family dynamic. She had built a successful career in real estate and had a talent for identifying profitable investment opportunities. For years, this arrangement felt stable, even prosperous. The restaurants thrived under David's management, while Michael's culinary innovations attracted younger customers without alienating the loyal regulars who had supported the business for decades. Jennifer's real estate connections helped the family acquire better locations for expansion, and my financial guidance ensured that their growth was sustainable rather than reckless. I should have recognized the first warning signs during the family meetings that became increasingly frequent after Patricia's minor heart episode 2 years ago. The discussions about estate planning and business succession that had once been theoretical suddenly carried new urgency. Robert and Patricia were approaching 70, and the question of how to transfer ownership of a multi-million-dollar restaurant empire became a source of subtle but persistent tension. Michael argued that his culinary contributions deserved equal recognition in any succession plan, while David maintained that his years of business management warranted primary control. Jennifer often mediated these conversations with a diplomatic skill that I initially admired, though I would later recognize as calculated manipulation. She had a way of reframing conflicts as opportunities, of making everyone feel heard while subtly steering conversations toward conclusions that served her interests. The family's trust in my financial expertise made me a natural mediator in these discussions. They valued my objectivity as someone who understood both the business and the family dynamics, without being emotionally invested in the outcome. At least, that's what I believed at the time. Looking back, I realized that my perceived neutrality made me the perfect, unwitting accomplice in what would unfold. I genuinely wanted what was best for everyone. The Chen family had welcomed me with an openness that still moves me to remember. Patricia had taught me her closely guarded recipes, not just the ingredients but the intuitive adjustments that turned good food into something extraordinary. Robert had shared stories of their early struggles with a vulnerability that revealed his deep trust in me as family. Their acceptance had filled a void I hadn't even realized existed, giving me the large, warm family I had always craved. That love, that sense of belonging, would soon become the weapon they used against me. They, blank, underscore, blank. The email arrived on a Wednesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports for another client. I remember the exact moment because I had just finished calculating projected tax savings for a bakery chain when my phone chimed with a notification that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. The sender was listed as Pacific Northwest Elder Services, a name I didn't recognize but assumed was some kind of senior care organization. The subject line read, "Confirmation of Financial Power of Attorney Transfer, Chen Family Trust." My coffee grew cold as I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I hadn't been involved in any power of attorney arrangements for Robert and Patricia. David and I had discussed the possibility months earlier, but no concrete steps had been taken. More unsettling was the fact that the email contained detailed information about bank accounts, property deeds, and business assets that should have been confidential family information. The message itself was professionally formatted, complete with official letterhead in what appeared to be legitimate legal language. According to the document, Robert and Patricia Chen had signed over comprehensive financial authority to Michael Chen, effective immediately. The transfer included control over all restaurant properties, business bank accounts, investment portfolios, and even the family's primary residence in Beaverton. What made my hands shake wasn't just the content, but the timing. Just 3 days earlier, David and I had attended Patricia's birthday dinner, where she seemed perfectly lucid and made no mention of any legal arrangements. She had even joked about how she planned to work in the kitchen until she was 90, following the example of her own grandmother, who had managed a food stall in Taipei well into her 80s. I tried calling David immediately, but his phone went straight to voicemail. He was at the original restaurant location, probably dealing with the lunch rush and unable to answer. My next instinct was to call the number listed at the bottom of the email, but something held me back. Maybe it was my years of experience dealing with financial fraud attempts, or maybe it was the subtle wrongness in the document's formatting that my trained eye couldn't ignore. Instead, I did what I always do when something doesn't add up. I started investigating. The Pacific Northwest Elder Services website looked legitimate at first glance, complete with staff photos, client testimonials, and detailed service descriptions. But when I examined it more closely, inconsistencies began to emerge. The staff photos were generic stock images that I recognized from other websites. The testimonials contained grammatical errors that suggested they had been written by someone whose first language wasn't English. Most tellingly, the business address corresponded to a strip mall mailbox service in Hillsborough. I spent the next 2 hours cross-referencing business registrations, checking Better Business Bureau records, and tracing the website's registration information. Pacific Northwest Elder Services had been incorporated just 6 weeks earlier, with a registered agent whose name appeared on dozens of other recently created businesses. The pattern suggested a shell company designed to look legitimate while serving a specific short-term purpose. The deeper I dug, the more disturbed I became. The bank accounts mentioned in the email were real, but they weren't the accounts I knew about. Over the years of managing the family's financial planning, I had become familiar with their primary business accounts, savings portfolios, and property holdings. These accounts contained references to assets I had never seen before, including several commercial properties and investment funds worth millions of dollars. My phone finally rang just after 2 in the afternoon. David's name appeared on the screen, and I answered before the first ring finished. "Rachel, I just saw your messages. What's going on?" His voice carried the rushed tone of someone who had stepped away from work crisis to return a call. "David, did your parents sign any power of attorney documents recently, specifically giving Michael control over the family finances?" The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When David finally spoke, his voice had changed. The casual warmth I was accustomed to had been replaced by something more guarded. "Where did you hear about that?" he asked. The question itself was an answer. Not a denial, not confusion, but a defensive inquiry about my source of information. My chest tightened as I realized that David already knew about arrangements that had been made without my knowledge or involvement. I received an email confirmation from something called Pacific Northwest Elder Services. "David, what's happening here? Why wasn't I told about any of this?" Another long pause. I could hear kitchen sounds in the background, the familiar clatter of prep work, and muffled conversations in multiple languages that had always made the restaurant feel like home to me. Now those sounds felt distant, like they belonged to a world I no longer had access to. "It's complicated, Rachel. Mom and Dad made some decisions about business succession planning. Michael has been handling a lot of the day-to-day financial stuff lately, and they thought it made sense to formalize the arrangement. But why wouldn't you discuss this with me first? I've been managing your family's financial planning for over a decade. I know these accounts, these assets. Some of the information in this email doesn't match anything I've seen before. Look, I can't really talk about this right now. We're slammed here, and I need to get back to the kitchen. Can we discuss this tonight when I get home?" The conversation ended with promises to talk later that felt hollow and evasive. I sat in my office staring at the phone, trying to reconcile the David the First knew with the man who had just deflected my legitimate concerns with bureaucratic language and avoidance. That evening, David came home 3 hours later than usual. He claimed that a new server had called in sick and he'd had to cover additional shifts, but something in his demeanor suggested he had used the extra time to prepare for our conversation. His responses to my questions felt rehearsed, as if he had practiced explaining away my concerns. According to David, his parents had become increasingly worried about estate planning after Patricia's health scare. They had consulted with Michael and Jennifer about the best way to ensure business continuity if something happened to them. The power of attorney arrangement was meant to be temporary, just until more comprehensive succession planning could be completed. "But why Michael instead of you?" I asked. "You've been running the operations for years. You understand the business better than anyone." David's explanation felt crafted rather than genuine. Michael had more time to dedicate to administrative tasks. Jennifer's real estate background made her valuable for property management decisions. David preferred to focus on the operational aspects rather than paperwork and legal matters. Each answer raised new questions that David seemed increasingly reluctant to address. When I pressed for details about the asset transfers mentioned in the email, he became defensive, accusing me of being suspicious of his family's internal decisions. When I pointed out inconsistencies between the information I had and what he was telling me, he suggested that my memory of their financial situation might be incomplete. The conversation ended with David going to bed early, claiming exhaustion from the long day at work. I stayed awake until nearly 3 a.m, reviewing every document I had related to the Chen family finances. The picture that emerged was troubling in ways I was only beginning to understand. Over the years, I had maintained detailed records of my consulting work with the family business. Tax returns, investment recommendations, property assessments, succession planning drafts. But when I compared these records to the information in the email, significant discrepancies emerged. Properties I had never heard of. Bank accounts that didn't appear in any documentation I possessed. Investment portfolios that seemed to have been established without my knowledge. Either the email was fraudulent, which would mean someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create convincing forgeries, or there were substantial aspects of the Chen family's financial situation that had been deliberately hidden from me. Given David's reaction to my questions, the latter possibility seemed increasingly likely. I made a decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of confronting the family directly, or allowing David to continue deflecting my concerns, I would conduct my own investigation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I had the skills, the resources, and the professional knowledge to uncover the truth about what was happening. More importantly, I had the moral obligation to ensure that Robert and Patricia weren't being taken advantage of, even if that meant challenging the family members I loved. The next morning, I began making discreet inquiries with contacts in the banking and real estate industries. I filed information requests with county records offices. I researched the legal framework surrounding elder financial abuse and power of attorney manipulation. What I discovered would shatter my understanding of the people I had called family for over 15 years. But that Wednesday morning, staring at an email that made no sense, I still believed that love and truth would ultimately prevail. I still thought I was dealing with a misunderstanding that could be resolved through honest communication and careful investigation. I had no idea that I was actually staring at the first visible crack in an elaborate deception that had been years in the making. The only thing I knew for certain was that something was terribly wrong, and I was apparently the only person willing to acknowledge that fact. Half-stay blank, underscore blank. The Multnomah County property records told a story that contradicted everything I thought I knew about my husband's family. Sitting in the sterile fluorescent lighting of the records office, I traced my finger down columns of data that revealed a complex web of real estate transactions spanning the past 3 years. Properties had been bought, sold, and transferred through a maze of limited liability companies with names like Oregon Hospitality Holdings and Pacific Rim Investment Group. What made my stomach drop wasn't just the existence of these transactions, but their timing. Major property transfers had occurred during periods when I was traveling for work, or when David had told me his parents were too busy with restaurant operations to meet about financial planning. While I had been respecting their need for space and focusing on my other clients, millions of dollars in real estate had been moving through channels I knew nothing about. The pattern became clearer as I worked backward through the records. The original Chen's Garden location, which I had always understood to be owned outright by Robert and Patricia, had been refinanced twice in the past 18 months. The proceeds from these refinancing deals hadn't been reinvested in restaurant improvements or expansion, as David had mentioned in passing conversations. Instead, the money had flowed into the same LLC accounts that were now under Michael's power of attorney control. Even more troubling was the discovery that the family's Beaverton home, where Patricia had hosted countless Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations, had been used as collateral for a series of business loans. The house that represented 30 years of hard work and careful saving was now leveraged to the point where a single missed payment could result in foreclosure. I photographed every relevant document with my phone, trying to maintain a calm demeanor while my mind raced through the implications. The elderly clerk who had been helping me navigate the filing system seemed to notice my distress. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked with genuine concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just trying to understand some family business arrangements," I managed to say, though my voice probably betrayed more than I intended. "Oh, family business," she nodded knowingly. "That can be complicated. I see a lot of folks in here trying to sort out what their relatives have been up to. Sometimes families don't communicate as well as they should about important matters." Her words carried an unintentional weight that stayed with me as I left the records office. How many other families had sat in those same chairs, discovering that their loved ones had made financial decisions that would affect everyone without bothering to include them in the conversation? The drive back to my downtown office gave me time to process what I had learned, but also to notice something that made my anxiety spike higher. A dark blue sedan had been behind me since I left the county building, maintaining a consistent distance through several turns that should have naturally separated our routes. When I took an unexpected detour through the Pearl District, the car followed. When I stopped at a coffee shop I never frequented, it parked across the street. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of discovering my in-laws' hidden financial dealings was making me imagine threats that didn't exist. But 15 years of investigating financial fraud had taught me to trust my instincts, especially when patterns emerged that felt deliberately constructed. Back in my office, I spread the property records across my conference table alongside the financial documents I had been collecting. The scope of what I was seeing began to crystallize into something far more sophisticated than simple family miscommunication. This wasn't a case of Robert and Patricia making poor decisions or Michael overstepping his bounds as their son. This was systematic asset manipulation designed to transfer wealth while obscuring the trail of how it was happening. The shell companies that owned various properties were connected through a network of shared addresses, registered agents, and cross-referenced business relationships. Oregon Hospitality Holdings listed Jennifer Chen as its registered agent, while Pacific Rim Investment Group showed Michael Chen as the managing member. Both companies had been incorporated within weeks of each other, suggesting coordinated planning rather than organic business development. What made this scheme particularly clever was how it exploited the family's legitimate business expansion. Each property acquisition or refinancing could be justified as a reasonable step in growing the restaurant empire. The paperwork looked professional, the business rationale made sense, and the transactions were structured to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements that might have attracted regulatory attention. But when viewed as a complete picture, the pattern revealed something darker. Valuable assets were being systematically transferred from Robert and Patricia's direct ownership into entities controlled by Michael and Jennifer. The older generation was being left with debt obligations and operational responsibilities, while their children accumulated the valuable real estate and liquid assets that represented their life's work. I spent the rest of the afternoon calling contacts in the banking industry, trying to understand how these transactions had been approved without triggering normal safeguards for elderly account holders. What I learned was deeply unsettling. The power of attorney documents that Michael possessed were comprehensive enough to authorize any financial transaction on behalf of his parents, as long as the paperwork appeared legitimate and the account holders hadn't filed complaints. Banks were legally obligated to process the requests. The system assumes that families act in good faith, explained Janet Morrison, a compliance officer at a major regional bank who had helped me with previous client issues. We're not supposed to second-guess legitimate family arrangements, even when they involve significant asset transfers. Unless there are obvious red flags or formal abuse allegations, we process the transactions and assume the family members are acting in everyone's best interest. But what constitutes a red flag? I asked. Usually it's the elderly person themselves calling to report unauthorized activity, or maybe a concerned family member filing a formal complaint. Sometimes we'll see unusual spending patterns or account activity that seems inconsistent with the person's historical behavior. But if the paperwork is in order and nobody is raising objections, we're limited in how much we can investigate. The conversation confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. Michael and Jennifer had constructed their scheme to operate within the boundaries of legitimate business activity while relying on family loyalty and discretion to prevent anyone from asking uncomfortable questions. As long as Robert and Patricia didn't complain and David didn't challenge his brother's authority, the asset transfers could continue indefinitely. That evening, I decided to confront the situation directly. I drove to the Beaverton house, where I knew the family would be gathering for their weekly Sunday dinner. The tradition had been a constant throughout my marriage to David, a time when work pressures were set aside, and 3 generations came together to share Patricia's cooking and catch up on each other's lives. The house looked exactly as it always had, with Patricia's meticulously maintained garden and Robert's collection of wind chimes creating their familiar melody on the front porch. But walking up the sidewalk, I felt like I was approaching foreign territory, rather than a place where I had been welcomed as family for over a decade. Michael answered the door with his usual easy smile, but I noticed something different in his eyes when he saw me. A flicker of calculation, as if he was assessing how much I might know about things he preferred to keep private. "Rachel, we weren't expecting you tonight. David said you were working late on some client project." "I finished early," I said, stepping into the familiar warmth of the entryway. "I was hoping to talk with everyone about some family business matters." "Of course, come in. Mom's just finishing up in the kitchen, and Dad's in his usual spot watching the news." The normalcy of the scene almost made me question whether I was overreacting to what I had discovered. Robert sat in his worn leather recliner, reading glasses perched on his nose as he followed the evening news with the focused attention he brought to everything. Patricia moved between the stove and dining table with the efficient grace of someone who had been preparing family meals for decades. Jennifer sat at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone while offering occasional commentary on whatever story was playing on the television. But when I looked more carefully, I noticed subtle changes that hadn't registered during previous visits. Patricia seemed more tired than usual, her movements lacking their typical energy. Robert kept glancing toward Michael whenever financial topics came up in the news coverage. Jennifer's attention seemed more focused on monitoring conversations than participating in them. I've been reviewing some property records related to the restaurants, I began, addressing the room in general, rather than any specific family member. There seemed to be some ownership changes and refinancing deals that I wasn't aware of. I'm hoping someone can help me understand what's been happening. The silence that followed felt deliberate, rather than surprised. Michael exchanged a quick glance with Jennifer before responding. Oh, that. Yeah, we've been working on some restructuring to optimize the business tax situation. Jennifer found some opportunities to improve our property holdings through different ownership structures. What kind of restructuring? I asked, keeping my tone neutral despite the growing tension I felt. Jennifer looked up from her phone with the practiced smile she used when discussing real estate deals with clients. Just some standard asset protection strategies. When you have a successful business like the restaurants, you want to make sure everything is structured to minimize tax liability and protect against potential legal issues. But why wasn't I consulted about these changes? I've been handling the family's financial planning for years. These kinds of major restructuring decisions usually benefit from professional guidance. The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Patricia continued setting the table as if she hadn't heard, but her movements had become more mechanical. Robert cleared his throat in the way he always did when uncomfortable topics arose. Michael's response came with a defensive edge that confirmed my suspicions that I was touching on sensitive territory. We didn't want to bother you with routine business decisions. You're busy with your own clients, and this was just updating some paperwork to reflect changes we'd already discussed as a family. Routine business decisions? I pulled out my phone and showed him one of the property transfer documents I had photographed. This shows the original restaurant location being refinanced for $2.8 million. That's hardly routine. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. Jennifer's smile disappeared. Michael's casual demeanor became more guarded. Patricia stopped moving entirely, her hands frozen while holding dinner plates she had been about to place on the table. Rachel. Robert's voice carried a tone I had never heard from him before, formal and distant. I think you might be misunderstanding some business arrangements that don't really concern you. The words hit like a physical blow. In 15 years of marriage to David, Robert had never spoken to me as an outsider. He had always included me in family discussions, valued my professional opinion, and treated me with the respect due to a daughter rather than an in-law. Now he was telling me that major financial decisions affecting the family business didn't concern me. These arrangements do concern me, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. The refinancing deals are secured by properties that could affect everyone's financial security. If something goes wrong with these loans, the entire family could lose everything you've worked 30 years to build. Michael stepped forward with an expression that combined irritation with something that looked almost like pity. Rachel, I think you're overcomplicating this. Mom and Dad asked me to handle some administrative tasks so they wouldn't have to worry about paperwork and legal details. That's all this is. Then why are the proceeds from the refinancing flowing into LLC accounts instead of back into the restaurant operations? Why are properties being transferred into companies that didn't exist 6 months ago? Why does the power of attorney documentation give you control over assets that aren't even listed in the financial records I've been maintaining? The questions came faster than I had intended, driven by months of suppressed suspicion, and the growing certainty that I was the only person in the room who didn't understand what was really happening. But instead of providing answers, my directness seemed to trigger a coordinated response that revealed just how carefully this moment had been anticipated. Patricia finally spoke, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. Rachel, dear, I think maybe you've been working too hard lately. You seem very stressed about things that really aren't as complicated as you're making them. Jennifer nodded in agreement. Family business arrangements can seem confusing from the outside, but we're all working together to make sure Mom and Dad are taken care of as they get older. The unified response felt rehearsed, as if they had discussed how to handle exactly this type of confrontation. But what disturbed me most was the realization that David hadn't arrived yet. Despite the family dinner tradition that brought everyone together at the same time each week, his absence felt deliberate rather than coincidental, as if he had been warned to stay away while they dealt with my questions. "Where's David?" I asked. "He's dealing with some staffing issues at the restaurant," Michael replied quickly. He said he'd try to make it later if he could get away. Standing in that kitchen, surrounded by people I had considered family for over a decade, I felt more isolated than I had ever felt in my life. Every question I asked was deflected. Every concern I raised was dismissed as misunderstanding or stress. Every attempt to get straight answers was met with explanations that felt like they were designed to confuse rather than clarify. But I wasn't going to let them convince me that I was imagining problems that were clearly documented in official records. I wasn't going to accept being excluded from decisions that could devastate the financial security of people I cared about. And I definitely wasn't going to pretend that complex asset transfers were routine paperwork that didn't require professional oversight. "I think I need to speak with David directly about this," I said, gathering my purse and heading toward the door. "And I think all of you need to understand that I'm not going to ignore what I've discovered just because it's inconvenient to discuss." Michael followed me to the entryway, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Rachel, I hope you're not planning to create problems over business decisions that have already been made. This family has been through enough stress with Mom's health issues. We don't need additional drama from people who don't understand the full situation." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. I was being warned not to pursue my investigation further, not to ask uncomfortable questions, and not to challenge arrangements that had been deliberately concealed from me. But the warning only confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. I wasn't dealing with misunderstandings or miscommunication. I was dealing with people who had something significant to hide. "I understand the situation better than you think I do," I replied, meeting his stare with one of my own, "and I'm going to make sure that everyone understands it just as clearly." Driving home through the familiar streets of Beaverton, I realized that I had crossed a line from which there would be no return. I was no longer trying to resolve family misunderstandings or improve communication. I was investigating what appeared to be systematic financial fraud, and my own in-laws were the primary suspects. The dark blue sedan was behind me again, maintaining that same careful distance that suggested professional surveillance rather than coincidence. This time, I didn't tell myself I was being paranoid. I was being watched because someone wanted to know exactly how much I had discovered and what I planned to do about it. But they had made a crucial mistake in underestimating my determination to protect the people I loved, even if those people had apparently decided that I was now the enemy. I had spent my career helping families preserve their financial security against external threats. Now I would have to protect them against threats from within their own ranks, whether they wanted that protection or not. Blank, underscore, blank. The lawsuit papers arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a professional process server who knocked on my office door with the kind of polite persistence that immediately signals trouble. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have, weighted with implications I wasn't prepared to face. Chen Family Holdings LLC versus Rachel Martinez read the header, followed by language that transformed 15 years of marriage and family relationships into cold legal accusations. The complaint alleged that I had systematically manipulated elderly family members, exploited my position as their financial advisor to gain unauthorized access to confidential business information, and used that access to interfere with legitimate business operations for my own financial benefit. According to the 14-page document, I had become obsessed with controlling the Chen family's financial decisions to the point where my behavior had become erratic and threatening. The lawsuit claimed that my unauthorized investigation into private family business matters constituted harassment and invasion of privacy. It alleged that my confrontational behavior was causing emotional distress to Robert and Patricia, who were described as frail elderly individuals being victimized by their daughter-in-law's inappropriate demands for information about arrangements that didn't concern me. The most devastating allegation was buried in the middle of the complaint. According to sworn statements from multiple family members, I had been using my access to the family's financial records to identify business opportunities that I had then pursued with my own clients, creating conflicts of interest that violated professional ethics standards. The lawsuit demanded immediate cessation of all contact with Chen family members, financial penalties for damages caused by my alleged misconduct, and a formal investigation into my business practices by the state licensing board. I read the document 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of calculated destruction. This wasn't just a lawsuit designed to stop my investigation. It was a comprehensive attack on my professional reputation, my personal relationships, and my ability to continue working as a financial consultant. Every question I had asked, every concern I had raised, had been reframed as evidence of my instability and inappropriate behavior. What made the accusations particularly cruel was how they twisted genuine family moments into evidence of manipulation. The Sunday dinners where I had offered business advice were now described as opportunities to extract confidential information. The estate planning discussions where I had provided professional guidance were characterized as attempts to influence vulnerable elderly people. My legitimate concerns about risky financial transactions were portrayed as interference with family autonomy. The timing of the lawsuit's filing created additional problems that I realized were probably intentional. News of the legal action would reach my professional network within days, if not hours. Clients would receive calls from reporters seeking comment on allegations against their financial advisor. Colleagues would distance themselves from someone facing ethics investigations. My business reputation, built carefully over nearly 2 decades, could be destroyed before I had a chance to defend myself. By noon, the phone calls had already started. Janet Morrison from the bank called first, her voice careful and professional in a way that suggested she had received legal guidance about how to handle our conversation. Rachel, I wanted to give you a heads up that we received a formal inquiry about our previous discussions regarding the Chen family accounts. I can't provide details, but I thought you should know that people are asking questions about your involvement in their financial matters. 3 more calls followed within the hour. A reporter from the Portland Business Journal wanted my comment on the lawsuit. A representative from the state licensing board informed me that a formal complaint had been filed and that I should expect an investigation. Most painful was the call from Maria Santos, a longtime client, whose family restaurant I had helped save from bankruptcy 5 years earlier. Rachel, I got a call this morning from someone claiming to be a journalist. They were asking about your business practices and whether I had ever seen you act inappropriately with client information. I told them you were completely professional, but her voice trailed off with the unspoken question of whether she should be concerned about continuing our business relationship. The isolation was swift and methodical. By the end of the week, 2 clients had terminated their contracts, citing concerns about potential negative publicity affecting their businesses. A speaking engagement at a local business conference was quietly canceled. The Small Business Development Center, where I occasionally taught financial planning workshops, suggested that I take a temporary leave of absence until the legal issues were resolved. Even more devastating was the way the lawsuit affected my personal relationships. Friends who had known me for years began asking careful questions about the situation, their tone suggesting they weren't sure whether to believe the allegations they were hearing. Neighbors in my downtown apartment building started avoiding eye contact in the elevator. The barista at my regular coffee shop, who had greeted me by name for 3 years, now served me with neutral professionalism that felt like a judgment. David's response to the lawsuit was the final confirmation that I was truly alone in this fight. When I called to ask why he hadn't warned me that legal action was being considered, his voice carried a coldness I had never heard before. Rachel, you brought this on yourself. Nobody asked you to investigate private family business arrangements. Nobody asked you to question decisions that mom and dad made with their own children. You created this situation by refusing to respect boundaries that should have been obvious. David, these aren't private family arrangements. This is systematic financial fraud targeting your parents. The lawsuit is designed to stop me from exposing what's really happening. What's really happening is that you've become obsessed with conspiracy theories because you can't accept that my family makes decisions without consulting you. The lawsuit is necessary to protect mom and dad from harassment. The conversation ended with David informing me that he would be staying at his parents' house indefinitely, until I could demonstrate that I was willing to respect the family's wishes and stop interfering with their business operations. 15 years of marriage dissolved into formal accusations and defensive positions, with both of us speaking through the protective barriers that legal conflict inevitably creates. The media coverage began 3 days after the lawsuit was filed. The Portland Business Journal ran a front-page story titled, "Local Financial Advisor Sued by Family for Alleged Elder Abuse." The article carefully used phrases like alleged misconduct and, quote, according to court documents. But the damage was immediate and comprehensive. My photograph appeared alongside descriptions of the accusations, creating a public association between my name and elder financial abuse that would be impossible to completely erase. The story was picked up by other local media outlets, each adding their own angle to the narrative. One television news segment featured an interview with a local elder law attorney who discussed the warning signs of financial exploitation, using my case as an example of how trusted advisors could abuse their positions. Another newspaper article quoted anonymous sources claiming that the Chen family had been victims of manipulation for years, but had been too trusting to recognize what was happening. What made the media coverage particularly devastating was how it inverted the actual truth of the situation. I was being portrayed as the predator, targeting vulnerable elderly victims, while Michael and Jennifer were presented as protective family members who had courageously stepped forward to defend their parents. The complex financial scheme I had uncovered was either ignored entirely or dismissed as legitimate business planning that I had misunderstood due to my alleged instability. The comments sections of online articles revealed how quickly public opinion could solidify around a narrative, regardless of its accuracy. Strangers who knew nothing about the situation beyond what they had read in headlines felt qualified to condemn my character and speculate about my motivations. Some comments suggested that I should face criminal charges. Others called for my professional licenses to be permanently revoked. A few defended me, but they were overwhelmed by the volume of negative responses. I stopped reading the coverage after finding a comment thread where someone had posted my home address, along with suggestions about how concerned citizens could express their disapproval of my alleged actions. The online harassment was extending into potential real-world threats, and I realized that the lawsuit was just one component of a broader campaign designed to destroy my ability to continue investigating or challenging the Chen family's financial arrangements. The most insidious aspect of the situation was how the lawsuit's allegations made it nearly impossible for me to defend myself without appearing to confirm the accusations. Any attempt to explain my concerns about the family's financial transactions could be characterized as continued harassment of elderly victims. Any evidence I presented about questionable asset transfers could be dismissed as information obtained through the inappropriate investigation methods described in the complaint. I was caught in a legal trap that transformed my legitimate professional concerns into evidence of my misconduct. The more I tried to explain what I had discovered, the more I appeared to be someone who couldn't accept reasonable boundaries. The stronger my evidence became, the more obsessive and threatening my behavior seemed to be. 3 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, I sat in my nearly empty office watching the Portland skyline through rain-streaked windows and confronted the possibility that I might lose everything I had worked to build. My client base was evaporating. My professional reputation was in ruins. My marriage was effectively over. The family I had loved for 15 years had successfully reframed me as their abuser rather than their potential protector. But in the quiet moments between phone calls from reporters and meetings with lawyers, I kept returning to the financial documents that had started this entire ordeal. The property transfers were still real. The shell companies were still moving millions of dollars through complex networks of accounts. The power of attorney arrangements were still being used to systematically strip Robert and Patricia of assets they had spent their lives accumulating. None of that had changed because of a lawsuit designed to discredit me. The truth remained the truth, regardless of how effectively it had been buried under allegations and media coverage. The question was whether I had the strength and resources to continue pursuing that truth when everyone around me was insisting that I was the problem. The answer came during a late-night review of my case files, when I found a folder containing thank you letters from clients whose businesses I had helped save over the years. Families who had avoided bankruptcy because I had identified financial irregularities in time. Small business owners who had protected their assets because I had recognized the warning signs of fraud. Elderly couples who had preserved their retirement savings because I had questioned investment schemes that seemed too good to be true. Every case had started with suspicions that seemed unreasonable to other people. Every investigation had faced resistance from individuals who preferred not to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. Every successful outcome had required persistence in the face of pressure to stop asking difficult questions. The Chen family situation was no different, except that this time I was fighting to protect people who had been convinced that I was their enemy. The lawsuit was evidence that I was getting close to something that someone desperately wanted to keep hidden. The media campaign was proof that the financial scheme I had uncovered was significant enough to justify extensive efforts to discredit me. Rather than being discouraged by the intensity of the opposition I was facing, I began to see it as confirmation that my investigation was on the right track. People don't file lawsuits and orchestrate media campaigns to stop someone from uncovering imaginary problems. They do it to stop someone from exposing real ones. That realization gave me the clarity I needed to develop a new strategy. Instead of trying to defend myself against accusations designed to make defense impossible, I would focus entirely on documenting the financial fraud with evidence so comprehensive that it couldn't be dismissed or ignored. I would build a case strong enough to withstand legal challenges and media spin, a case that would force the truth into the open regardless of the personal cost. The lawsuit had been intended to silence me, but it had actually freed me from any remaining hesitation about pursuing the investigation wherever it led. I no longer needed to worry about preserving family relationships or maintaining professional courtesy with people who had already declared war on my reputation. I could focus solely on gathering evidence and following the money trail, even if that trail led to conclusions that would destroy everything I had once believed about the people closest to me. The fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time since receiving that mysterious email about Pacific Northwest Elder Services, I felt like I understood the rules of the game I was playing. This wasn't about family disagreements or professional misunderstandings. This was about truth and deception, justice and corruption, and the question of whether one person's commitment to doing what's right could overcome a coordinated campaign designed to bury the truth under avalanche of lies and legal maneuvers. I was about to find out. Duty. _blank. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, when most of Portland was asleep, and I was deep into my 4th consecutive night of analyzing financial records by the glow of my laptop screen. My apartment had become a makeshift investigation center, with documents spread across every surface and timeline charts taped to the walls like evidence boards in a detective show. I had been living on coffee and determination, following money trails that seemed to disappear into digital dead ends before suddenly resurging in unexpected places. I had been tracking a series of wire transfers from Oregon Hospitality Holdings when I noticed something that made me sit up straighter in my chair. One of the receiving accounts belonged to a company called Cascade Property Management, which I initially assumed was another local real estate firm. But when I researched Cascade's business registration, I discovered something that changed the entire scope of my investigation. Cascade Property Management was owned by a larger entity called Northwest Investment Syndicate, which was itself a subsidiary of Pacific International Holdings. The ownership chain led through a maze of shell companies and foreign business registrations, but the ultimate destination was an investment firm based in Vancouver, British Columbia, with connections to several companies that had been flagged by federal authorities for suspicious international money transfers. What made my hands shake as I traced these connections was the realization that the Chen family scheme wasn't just about stealing from Robert and Patricia. It was part of a much larger operation designed to launder money through legitimate-looking business transactions involving immigrant-owned family enterprises. The restaurants weren't just being used as collateral for fraudulent loans. They were being used as fronts for moving money across international borders in ways designed to avoid detection by banking regulators. I spent the next 6 hours following the digital breadcrumbs, using techniques I had learned during my early career working with federal investigators on complex financial fraud cases. Every discovery led to more questions, but also to a clearer picture of how the scheme operated. Immigrant families with successful businesses were targeted by individuals who gained their trust, often through marriage or family connections. Once inside the family structure, these individuals would gradually gain control of business assets through power of attorney arrangements and legal documents that transferred ownership to shell companies. The stolen assets were then used as collateral for legitimate-looking business loans, with the proceeds funneled through networks of investment companies toward overseas accounts. The original family members were left with debt obligations they couldn't meet, often resulting in bankruptcy or foreclosure that provided cover for the asset transfers. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the money had already been moved through so many corporate entities that recovery was nearly impossible. The Chen family was just one piece of this puzzle. As I dug deeper, I found evidence of at least 6 other immigrant-owned businesses in the Pacific Northwest that had followed similar patterns of asset transfer and financial manipulation over the past 5 years. A Vietnamese bakery chain in Seattle, a Korean electronics import business in Tacoma, a Mexican restaurant group in Eugene. All had experienced the same progression of family power struggles, mysterious refinancing deals, and ultimate transfer of valuable assets to shell companies connected to the same network I had traced from Michael and Jennifer's transactions. What made the scheme particularly insidious was how it exploited cultural values that emphasized family loyalty and respect for authority. Elderly immigrants who had built successful businesses often trusted their children and in-laws to handle complex financial arrangements, especially when language barriers made legal documents difficult to understand completely. The criminals running this operation had identified these vulnerabilities and developed methods to exploit them systematically. I realized that my investigation had uncovered something far more significant than family fraud. This was organized crime operating at an international level, using sophisticated financial instruments and legal structures to steal millions of dollars from vulnerable communities, while hiding behind the appearance of legitimate business transactions. The evidence I had gathered was substantial, but I knew it would need to be presented in a way that could withstand the legal and public relations attacks that Michael and Jennifer had already demonstrated they were capable of mounting. I needed allies with the resources and authority to investigate this type of complex financial crime, and I needed them before the scheme could be dismantled or the evidence could be destroyed. My first call was to Special Agent Patricia Hendricks at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Portland. I had worked with Agent Hendricks 5 years earlier when one of my clients had been victimized by an investment fraud scheme, and she had impressed me with her ability to navigate complex financial investigations while maintaining focus on protecting victims rather than just securing convictions. Agent Hendricks, this is Rachel Martinez. I'm a financial consultant in Portland, and I believe I've uncovered evidence of an international money laundering operation targeting immigrant families. Missy Martinez, I remember you from the Henderson investment case. What kind of evidence are we talking about? I spent 45 minutes walking her through the network of shell companies, the pattern of asset transfers, and the connections to overseas investment firms that I had documented. Agent Hendricks asked detailed questions about how I had obtained the information and whether I could provide documentation that would meet federal evidence standards. This sounds like it could be part of something we've been tracking from other angles, she said when I finished my presentation. Can you come in this afternoon with copies of everything you've found? And Ms. Martinez, I need to ask this directly. Are you personally involved in any financial disputes with the families you're describing? I explained the lawsuit and the family situation that had led to my investigation, emphasizing that my personal conflict with the Chen family had actually helped me recognize patterns that might have been missed if I had been looking at the transactions as an outside investigator. Sometimes the best intelligence comes from people who have inside access to information that wouldn't normally be available, Agent Hendricks acknowledged. But we'll need to be careful about how we handle evidence that might be challenged based on how it was obtained. That afternoon, I sat in a sterile conference room in the federal building, watching Agent Hendricks and 2 other investigators review the financial documents I had spent months collecting and analyzing. The room was quiet except for the sound of pages turning and occasional quiet conversations between the agents as they verified details and cross-referenced information with their own databases. After 2 hours, Agent Hendricks looked up from the documents with an expression that combined professional satisfaction with genuine concern for the victims I had identified. Ms. Martinez, what you've uncovered here is consistent with intelligence we've been gathering about a transnational criminal organization that specializes in financial fraud targeting immigrant communities. Your documentation fills in gaps that we've been trying to understand for over a year. She explained that federal authorities had been tracking suspicious financial flows between the Pacific Northwest and overseas accounts, but had been unable to identify the specific method being used to generate the initial funds. My evidence about the asset manipulation schemes provided the missing piece of the puzzle that connected legitimate businesses to the international money laundering operation. We're going to need to move quickly on this, Agent Hendricks continued. If the subjects realize that their operation has been exposed, they'll start destroying evidence and moving assets beyond our reach. Are you prepared for the possibility that your cooperation with this investigation could escalate the legal and personal conflicts you're already facing? I thought about the lawsuit, the media coverage, and the complete destruction of my professional and personal relationships that had already occurred as a result of my investigation. The people who had orchestrated this scheme had already done everything they could to destroy my credibility and isolate me from potential supporters. Cooperating with federal investigators couldn't make my situation significantly worse, but it might finally provide a path toward justice for the families who had been victimized. Agent Hendricks, they've already taken everything I care about except my integrity and my commitment to doing what's right. If helping you stop this operation gives meaning to everything I've lost, then yes, I'm prepared for whatever comes next. The federal investigation moved with a speed and thoroughness that demonstrated how serious the authorities considered the crimes I had uncovered. Within a week, FBI agents were conducting surveillance on Michael and Jennifer, monitoring their communications, and tracing their financial transactions in real time. Banking regulators froze accounts connected to the shell companies I had identified. Immigration authorities began reviewing the status of individuals connected to the overseas investment firms. But the most significant development was the discovery that Robert and Patricia were not willing participants in the scheme targeting their family. When federal agents interviewed them separately, both elderly immigrants broke down and revealed that they had been threatened and manipulated into signing documents they didn't understand. Michael had told them that refusal to cooperate with his business arrangements would result in deportation proceedings against them, despite the fact that they had been legal residents for nearly 40 years. Patricia's testimony was particularly heartbreaking. Through tears, she described how Michael had convinced her that David and I were planning to have them declared mentally incompetent so that we could seize control of their assets. The power of attorney documents had been presented as protective measures to prevent their children from taking advantage of them, when in fact, they were the instruments being used to steal everything they had worked to build. I thought Michael was protecting us, Patricia told the federal agents. He said Rachel was trying to destroy our family, that she was using David to get access to our money. I didn't know that signing those papers would let him take away our restaurants, our house, everything we had. The revelation that my in-laws had been victims rather than accomplices changed my understanding of everything that had happened over the past year. Their coldness toward me during the family dinner confrontation hadn't been guilt or defensiveness about their participation in financial fraud. It had been fear and confusion, manipulated by someone they trusted into believing that I was the threat they needed to protect themselves against. David's participation in the scheme was more complex. Federal investigators determined that he had initially been unaware of Michael's criminal activities, but had gradually been drawn into the conspiracy through a combination of family pressure and financial incentives. Michael had convinced David that the asset transfers were necessary to protect the family business from potential legal liabilities, while also providing him with substantial personal benefits that made questioning the arrangements financially costly. The psychological manipulation involved in the scheme was as sophisticated as the financial components. Michael and Jennifer had systematically isolated potential opponents, created false narratives about threats to family security, and used cultural values and emotional bonds to prevent their victims from seeking outside help or verification of the claims they were being asked to accept. My investigation and eventual cooperation with federal authorities had disrupted this operation at a crucial moment. According to Agent Hendricks, the criminals had been preparing to execute the final phase of their scheme, which would have involved bankrupting the remaining legitimate businesses and moving all stolen assets to overseas accounts beyond the reach of American law enforcement. Your persistence probably saved your in-laws from losing everything, Agent Hendricks told me during one of our debriefing sessions. Another few months and there wouldn't have been anything left to recover. The federal investigation culminated in a coordinated operation involving multiple agencies and international law enforcement partners. On a cold Thursday morning in February, FBI agents executed search warrants at locations across Portland, while simultaneously freezing bank accounts and seizing assets connected to the criminal network. I watched the news coverage from my apartment, seeing federal agents leading Michael and Jennifer away in handcuffs, while reporters described the international money laundering scheme that had been operating in the Pacific Northwest for over 5 years. The same media outlets that had portrayed me as an unstable predator targeting vulnerable elderly victims were now reporting on the complex criminal conspiracy I had uncovered, and the courage required to pursue the truth despite personal and professional consequences. The vindication felt hollow in many ways. My marriage to David was irreparably damaged by the events of the past year, and even though he had been more victim than perpetrator, the trust between us could not be rebuilt. My professional reputation had suffered permanent damage that years of successful federal cooperation could not completely repair. The family relationships that had sustained me for 15 years were gone, replaced by a complicated mixture of gratitude, guilt, and awkwardness that made normal interactions nearly impossible. But there were also unexpected sources of healing and purpose that emerged from the wreckage. The other families who had been victimized by the same criminal network reached out to express their gratitude for my role in exposing the scheme and recovering their stolen assets. Patricia and Robert, once they understood how they had been manipulated and threatened, became some of my strongest supporters in rebuilding my reputation and establishing new professional relationships. Most importantly, I discovered that my experience had equipped me with unique expertise in recognizing and investigating financial crimes targeting immigrant communities. Federal agencies began consulting with me on similar cases across the country. Law schools invited me to speak about the intersection of family relationships and financial fraud. Advocacy organizations asked me to help develop educational materials for vulnerable communities. The work gave my life a sense of purpose that was deeper and more meaningful than anything I had experienced during my years as an independent consultant. I was no longer just helping individual families protect their assets. I was contributing to efforts that could protect thousands of families from predators who exploited their trust, their cultural values, and their limited familiarity with complex American financial systems. 6 months after Michael and Jennifer were sentenced to federal prison terms, I received a letter that reminded me why the entire ordeal had been worthwhile. It came from an elderly Korean couple in Seattle, whose electronics importing business had been targeted by the same criminal network I had helped expose. Ms. Martinez, the letter began, "We do not know each other, but because of your courage in reporting the criminals who were stealing from families like ours, we were able to keep our business and our home. The FBI agents told us that your investigation helped them understand how these bad people were hurting immigrants who work hard to build something good in America. We wanted you to know that your sacrifice protected many families who will never know your name but owe you everything." Reading those words in the quiet of my apartment, looking out at the Portland skyline that had witnessed both my destruction and my redemption, I finally understood what justice actually meant. It wasn't about punishment or vindication or even recognition. It was about the willingness to endure personal cost in order to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, even when those people initially viewed you as their enemy, rather than their advocate. The investigation that had cost me my marriage, my business reputation, and my sense of belonging in the family I had loved for 15 years, had ultimately revealed something more valuable than any of those losses. It had shown me that integrity isn't something you possess, it's something you choose, again and again, especially when that choice carries a price you're not sure you can afford to pay. Michael and Jennifer had calculated that I could be discredited, isolated, and silenced before I could expose their crimes. They had underestimated the power of persistence and the value of truth-telling. Even when the truth is inconvenient, complicated, and personally devastating to those who choose to pursue it. Standing at my window, Watching the sun set over a city where families could sleep more safely because a criminal conspiracy had been dismantled, I finally felt the peace that comes from knowing you chose correctly when the choice was difficult. The lawsuit papers, the media attacks, and the professional consequences had all been temporary. The protection of innocent families and the dismantling of a predatory criminal network would last forever. That was the difference between justice and revenge, between truth and comfort, between courage and convenience. The choice I had made to investigate rather than ignore, to persist rather than surrender, to protect rather than preserve my own interests, had ultimately created something larger and more meaningful than anything I had lost in the process. The file that made investigation teams storm the court hadn't just been evidence of financial fraud. It had been proof that ordinary people, armed with determination and guided by principles, could still make a difference in a world that often seemed designed to reward those who chose the easier path of looking the other way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.